There are new developments. Things are proceeding, seems to me, pretty quickly with the USMCA, the trade agreement that is sometimes described as NAFTA 2.0. Remember, Donald Trump got elected promising to throw out NAFTA. He's got a new deal. Looks like it's on its way in, but our next guest will tell us. Lori Wallach is director of the Global Trade Watch program at A Public Citizen. She has helped us understand the trade situation before, and we expect her to do so again now. So without any further ado, Lori Wallach, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much.
So let's see. It seems to me things have moved quite a bit on the NAFTA 2.0 front. First of all, is it fair to call this deal as it's taken shape NAFTA 2.0, or is it more of a change from the old NAFTA than that gives it credit for?
The deal that Trump negotiated and signed in 2018 deserves the moniker NAFTA 2.0. He gave it a different name, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, but the agreement in practice was in some ways worse than NAFTA. He allowed big pharma to rig in new monopoly protections that would have locked in high medicine prices. And the labor and environmental standards and their enforcement was not strong enough to possibly counter the race to the bottom outsourcing that has led to over 1 million US jobs being certified as killed by NAFTA. So the deal Trump signed was a real betrayal of his promise to working people to renegotiate NAFTA to fix it. It was in some ways worse and certainly not a fix. Then a year of fighting ensued, and that's what we're talking about now. The thing that came out the other end of the Democrats saying, we're not going to do that deal. And now we face, I guess, what we could not. There was the old NAFTA, there was Trump's NAFTA 2.0, and now we have the new NAFTA.
So, okay, so it's a new NAFTA. You could call it NAFTA 3.0 or 2.5. I've read different accounts of what it changes, what it keeps the same. So far, the closest I can get is that it seems to maybe take out a few bad things, maybe a little more for labor, maybe a little less of these extrajudicial corporate trade courts and so on. Would you say it's a big improvement, a modest improvement, and where are the big changes?
So the deal Trump signed was worse. The deal now is better than the original NAFTA, which doesn't say a lot because NAFTA was terrible, but the way you have to look at this circumstance is it's a decision between the existing NAFTA and its ongoing damage, and then whether it's possible to get something in place that could stop some of the job outsourcing, some of the corporate attacks on environmental and health laws. So this new NAFTA, after the Democrats forced the changes, here's where we stand. They got the big pharma handouts taken out, total victory. They were able previously to get some important changes on stopping mandatory natural resource exports. The agreement also, as you mentioned, largely whacks the outrageous investor-state dispute settlement system. Those are those tribunals where a multinational corporation can go to a tribunal of 3 corporate attorneys and demand unlimited compensation from taxpayers for any domestic law, regulation, court decision that they think violates their extraordinary investor rights. So that is totally eliminated for Canada, way whacked back for Mexico, and that's probably singularly the best thing that happens, and it's a big deal. Then the Democrats forced real improvements in the labor standards, though there's still problems, and pretty modest improvements in the environmental standards. There is a new labor enforcement regime that, if it works, is going to be powerful and effective, but that's a big if. I would say overall, where we are is, with the pluses and the minuses, we have something better than the NAFTA itself. So we could see that possibly some of the ongoing damage could be stopped. But what's really clear is this isn't the template. If you were negotiating an agreement from scratch, to do a progressive agreement that puts people on the planet first. This is what you do to stop some of NAFTA's ongoing damage.
So it's an incremental improvement, but it is not the ideal trade agreement of the future, I guess is what you're saying, right?
Yes. Yes.
So, and to a certain extent, is that because this was kind of a process of marking up or modifying the old NAFTA as opposed to starting from scratch? Or was that just because we have a Donald Trump in there as opposed to, let's say, a highly maybe progressive or highly pro-labor president signing that? Was it, how much of it was the process, you think, and how much of it was, obviously it was Trump who chose to renegotiate, but how much of that can we chalk up to, well, they were just marking up the old deal as opposed to, well, it was Trump that negotiated it and then the Democrats did the best they could to try to make it better?
It's a yes and a way. So in the first instance, the existing agreement that's in place is doing so much damage. 1 million jobs certified just under one narrow program. American jobs is lost to NAFTA. $400 million paid out to corporations in the outrageous investor state system after successful attacks on North American environmental, health, energy policies. So when you look at that mess, then the question in the first instance is, what can you do to stop some of the damage? That's a very different thing when you have a bad agreement in place than, say, you're looking at a TPP, and the TPP is either there's no agreement or there's a bad agreement. That wasn't our decision set here. With respect to what did or didn't get fixed in the NAFTA, I would say the overlap had to do with the guy who's the U.S. trade representative who agrees more with, I would say, some of the progressive critiques than any previous trade representative. It's not about Trump. I don't think Trump knows anything about these details. It's this particular trade ambassador. And the areas where there was overlap, getting rid of ISDS, putting in stronger labor standards and enforcement, tightening up some of the loopholes in NAFTA that allow goods from China to come in and with NAFTA benefits, some of those kinds of issues where he agreed with things that labor unions and consumer and environmental groups have been saying for decades are the things that got fixed. And the big question in a way is, given this isn't the template, if there is a President Warren or President Sanders who would really do a people and planet first trade agreement, then yeah, they're going to need to pick up where this left off. This is the floor. This is the floor from which we have to build towards a really progressive trade agreement that definitely puts people on the planet first. But this is a new floor also for any future president, for instance, a corporate-minded Democrat who now can't go and reinstate all those pharma giveaways and the ISDS, for instance, that was in TPP.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. And again, we're talking with Lori Wallach, who is the director of Global Trade Watch for Public Citizen. It's exactly my next question, Lori, was here you have, it seems to me in the dynamic as it's played out since Trump signed the first agreement in 2018, you have this agreement got better thanks to Democratic pressure on things like labor rights, on things like getting rid of the trade courts, the ISDS, which, according to studies, went overwhelmingly for corporations, tended to, were not geared towards people as a whole. It seems to me the Democrats were carrying the banner against bad provisions that they had previously negotiated into agreements with a Democratic administration like NAFTA or when Bill Clinton was president, or TPP when Barack Obama was president. It seems to me the Democrats were negotiating, doing good things, but negotiating against their old selves to a certain extent. Am I right about that?
There has always been a fundamental split between congressional Democrats, most of them, the vast majority of them, and presidents who are Democrats. So Bill Clinton and Barack Obama's trade policies were largely indistinguishable from Bush 1 and Bush 2. The TPP, frankly, was more corporate than the last of the Bush 2 agreements, because the last of the Bush 2 agreements came when the Democrats had a majority in the House. And they made Bush, just like they've just made Trump, make the agreements better. But in a circumstance where there was a Republican House and a Democratic president, Obama, you had very corporate agreements. In this circumstance, you had a Democratic House basically saying to a Republican president, one where the trade representative actually was much more inclined to fix some of the things that Democrats didn't like in the first instance. So we had an agreement that already had rolled back ISDS and that had some improvements in some of the manufacturing areas, that then when Democrats became a majority, they said, yeah, now here are all these other things you better do, because we're not having an agreement that gives new monopolies to big pharma to lock in high medicine prices and raise prices in Mexico and Canada. We're not going to do an agreement that doesn't have stronger labor and environmental standards and enforcement. But even with all that said, I want to be super clear. There is zero chance that this agreement is going to bring back hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs. The president is with no support in reality in saying that. If this works, it's going to mean people in Mexico will, for the first time in decades, generations, have real labor rights and real unions, be able to get the U.S. multinationals down there who are paying $2 an hour for jobs in Goodyear plants, in industrial bakeries that make the Oreo cookie, in GM and Ford plants, where the U.S. workers, union represented, are making $20+ an hour. Those workers in Mexico in the same high-tech plants making the exact same products are going to start to be able to be paid a decent wage. That is going to lessen the draw to outsource jobs from the U.S. to Mexico. And it could mean people in Mexico finally make enough to be able to buy some of the stuff workers in the U.S. make. That is if this system works of these changes. And with the ISDS system taken out, it also means there'll be less incentives to outsource, because of course ISDS made it cheaper and less risky to outsource. So if this works, that's the North American long-term hope. It's not going to be tons of jobs coming back. The president's just lying about that. And if you need any more proof, consider that since NAFTA was renegotiated, GM has announced mass layoffs and the shutdown of 6 plants while investing more in Mexico. Ford just announced the new electric Mustang SUV is going to be produced in Mexico, not in the U.S. After all the past Wranglers, Mustangs, there are a lot of iconic cars that are produced in the U.S. That's part of the marketing. Not this new Mustang that was announced after the revised NAFTA. And still, I mean, that shows you how the big companies think about it, not as something that forces them to bring back jobs.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's also really interesting, Lori Wallach, your point about a Democratic president plus a Republican House, which was the case when Obama negotiated the TPP. I believe it was also the case when Bill Clinton negotiated NAFTA, too, after the GOP took the House back. So last question for you then, I guess. Before we wrap up. So enforcement, how much an administration chooses to enforce the provisions have a lot to do with it too, right? I mean, there were protections in the old NAFTA for labor leaders. We saw the killing of labor leaders in Latin America not leading to enforcement actions on the U.S. side. We saw in the agreement that covered, I believe it was Malaysia, child labor being overlooked so that it got a good rating. So how much of this new deal, as opposed to the last deal, depends on the discretion of an administration to carry it out?
So first of all, just on NAFTA, sadly, Bill Clinton had a Democratic majority.
Oh, okay, I was wrong.
Democrats lost the House in 1994 because in November of 1993, they passed NAFTA. And it was a majority of Republicans plus a minority of the majority Democrats joined the Republicans to pass NAFTA. So the circumstance about enforcement is tricky. So right now they're writing an implementing bill because, this is a shocker. They just came to this new deal and they're going to try and have a vote on it next week. So no one's seen the implementing legislation. They're trying to write into the implementing legislation some automaticity so that, if there is a good faith complaint that the right to associate and the right to collectively bargain are not being met as required in the agreement, then a case that is brought, the Trade Representative's Office has to go through the initial stages of the process. But there are plenty of places along the way that you're right. If there is a bad faith effort by a trade representative to not enforce and not use the new tools in the agreement, then you could see a lack of enforcement. The enforcement tools, I would say, it's like having a very sturdy Chevy, where before you basically had a lot of missing a spark plug. I mean, that was not enforceable. Now you've got a Chevy, but like, maybe a 90s Chevy, and it ain't no Cadillac, but it's serviceable. It's like it will get you from point A to point B if you don't see, for instance, an administration trying to intentionally drive it over a cliff.
Okay, well, I think that's fair enough as an analogy, and of course we will stipulate that it is an American-made Chevy for the purposes of this discussion, although I hope that the people who make them overseas also get better wages and working conditions going forward. We'll have to leave it there. Lori Wallach, again, Director of the Global Trade Watch Program at Public Citizen, thank you so much for enlightening us on this issue.
Thank you, and everyone stay tuned on this because you've got folks, members of Congress and also unions and environmental and other groups all over the map on what should happen next. So watch for the next week.